the Lewis and Clark Exposition, and a massive event that took place in 1905 and was critical in bringing the city of Portland, Oregon in its earlier years into greater prominence, and would spark a massive population boom in the city immediately following, and the city's just been growing like that ever since. Now look at these beautiful images. These are images of the bridge that crossed Guild Lake, and you would just follow it towards these massive, beautiful structures, primarily the U.S. government building. Just look at these beautiful images and just imagine how, this is how it looked everywhere in this area. Imagine how beautiful it looked. And believe it or not, I'm standing along 29th Avenue heading this way. This is essentially in line with the bridge that took you out to the island or peninsula, as far as I'm concerned, to the U.S. government building and these other beautiful structures overlooking the lake during the great Lewis and Clark Exposition. And standing here 114 years later, I'm about to turn around and show you the same view from those pictures looking down the bridge, show you how beautiful it still is. Ready? What? What do you expect? A lot changes in 114 years.
Steve the Amateur Historian.
So, the Lewis and Clark Exposition. This is a video I always knew I was going to make eventually. It was just a matter of time. I didn't want to just make it because it's such a prominent piece of Portland history, and it really was significant in bolstering Portland's status as a West Coast city, you know, way back in 1905. But it's also because it's so astonishingly different right here. Like, I'm standing practically right in the middle of where the exposition took place. There'd be elaborate buildings there, there'd be Guild Lake over here, there'd be the big bridge crossing here. This would all be, I'd be right dead center in the beauty and grandeur of the Lewis and Clark Exposition. So I want to take you to a lot of the sites and kind of meander through here and do the best I can to show you where all these various structures were, to bring you a lot of imagery to really show you what it looks like to compare to now, which is just a lot of this. You can't even see this. It looks like it's just white sky behind me, but this is actually a big-ass building. This is, like, it's all industrial here now. Nothing like it was then. You couldn't tell. You'd see the pictures and see the sites and be like, there's no way it's the same area, but it 100% is. Now, the Lewis and Clark Exposition was, you know, it was very well received. One of the reasons it was so successful is the people of the city were completely behind it. They thought it was a fantastic idea. They helped make it happen. They helped out financially. It made all the sense in the world. Here you got the city of Portland, which is just a little over, realistically, a little over 50 years old, and it's growing, but it's still the start of the 1900s, and it's the West Coast, and there's just, you know, there's the random cities on the West Coast, you know, LA, San Francisco, Portland, Seattle, but still, you know, the West Coast is just still kind of developing and it doesn't really have the status that, you know, the East Coast does, but at the same time, you know, like LA and, you know, San Francisco are, you know, burgeoning cities, I can't remember the word. but you know, big cities, and Portland wanted a piece of that. And this was a great opportunity to do it. 1805 was when Lewis and Clark passed through. It's now 1905. It's the centennial of that event, or series of events when you get down to it. I could have caught that bus. Anyway, and so the city of Portland decided to have their own kind of, it was essentially a knockoff World's Fair. The people that oversought, the proprietors of the actual World's Fairs that happened, didn't regard it quite as a World's Fair, but essentially that's what it was. There was a lot of significant things that happened there, and a lot of money was put into it. These big, grand buildings, so much effort was put into this, and an effort to get Portland a little bit of status, to get Portland on the map, and it worked. The city of Portland, in the 10 to 15 years following the exposition, population exploded. People came, people flocked to this city to be here after they and a lot of them were affected by either experiencing probably the Lewis and Clark Exposition or hearing about it, and hearing about some of the wild stuff that's happening in Portland, even though it was just one event. And when it was over, everything out here was essentially forgotten, abandoned, neglected, even though what happened here did so much in terms of putting the city of Portland on the map. But you know, they strung electricity through it. They did things at this Lewis and Clark shindig that literally knocked people's socks off. Things happened here that were greater than some of the things that were happening at actual World's Fairs. Like, that's how big and significant this event truly was. And as I'm climbing the hill, like, you know, they were I'm standing literally where buildings would have been. Guilds Lake would have been right over here. Like, I'm right in the middle of it all. And so it's really a crazy, wild, gripping piece of Portland history. But when you see the imagery of it, the true raw imagery of how they made things look here, which that's obviously the focus of this video, is taking you here and showing you what's here now compared to what was established here in 1905. And it's just, it's indescribable how beautiful it was, what they had created. Because it wasn't just the buildings, it was the gardens, the statues, the vibe. They just, and the fact that it was 1905 and they made it look so absolutely beautiful and amazing. And that's really what I want to get to the heart of, is what it looks like then, what it looks like now, and just the stark contrast between the two. So that said, I might as well go to the start, the main entrance, or at least what was the main entrance to get into the Lewis and Clark Exposition. And to find where the entrance, the pearly gates entering this place, because it would have all been all through here. Coming to the intersection, this is 26th as the crossing street, and then this is Upshur going east and west. And right here, where this really awesome building, I guess it's living quarters and store space down here, this is where, at this intersection, so in the northwest intersection of 26th and Upshur, this is where the entry gates would have been, is right here. And if I can get across here live, lo and behold, I see one of these, and that immediately makes me think this has something to do with the Lewis and Clark Exposition. Well, bust my buttons. Yep, so this is in relation to it. On this site stood the 1905 Lewis and Clark Centennial Exposition, Oregon's first World's Fair. Again, not officially a World's Fair, but it was our World's Fair. Extending approximately from 24th to 29th avenues from Upshur to St. Helens Road. So from Upshur, heading off this way, and this is 26th, so from 24th, 2 blocks that way, to 29th, 3 blocks that way. And I mean, actually, it technically crossed St. Helens Road onto the island. Yeah, it's reference to Guilds Lake and so on and so forth. And here's It's a general view looking north. So you see here's, I believe this is the entry. It doesn't say exactly where the entry gates, but it would have been, yeah, this is the entry gates. So literally, I'm technically standing right here facing this way. So I'm facing away from the park. So if I was to turn and literally face into this building, looking this way, I would literally be looking towards all of these beautiful buildings and stuff. And then here is the bridge crossing to the little island. And yeah, the Grand Plaza and the Sunken Gardens. So I think this is what was located right here. So again, if I turned and generally looked this way, I would be looking right at this. So yeah, so of course they put this, it makes all the sense in the world to put the plaque right here, as this is where the main entrance would have been at 26th and Upshur. So you'd go through the gates and you'd head off this way and you'd see some things you'd never seen before. So I'm now walking north on 26th, so I'd actually be like having just entered the complex and be walking towards these, you know, buildings. A lot of construction going on. So yeah, obviously none of these buildings were here yet. And it's hard to describe, but there was actually the roads weren't made up like they are right through here, because there was a Lewis and Clark Boulevard that actually ran diagonal. They ran from the northeast to the southwest, whereas all these roads are, you know, on a grid pattern. They go north and south or east and west. And so starting probably about a block north this way, just passing Vaughn and 26th. Yeah, Lewis and Clark Boulevard would have started right up over here and kind of bisected through here going this way, making it back towards Upshur. So all the buildings weren't lined up the way that they are now. They'd be like, you know, like looking at the side of this building, you're looking this direction. But for the buildings that were located through here, you'd be looking more in a northwesterly direction and seeing the front of each building. So yeah, the buildings literally just kind of lined through. There was like a couple buildings over here, and they just kind of lined through this way and kind of started, as they went along, they started going more kind of in this direction, because Lewis and Clark Boulevard was going, again, diagonal from the way the streets are today. And there's a Montgomery Park building, which is built, you know, obviously afterwards, but is, you know, Montgomery Park building is right in the center of where the exposition really was. And so I'm going to try to describe the locations of these buildings best I can, as obviously not only are, you know, was the structure of the roads through here completely different, but also an important thing to realize is I did the best, like this is my map. I printed off a Google map and then marked the locations based on where they were on literally hand-drawn maps that were made of the exposition. I couldn't really find online a real solid map of, you know, where everything was perfectly during the exposition. It was such a brief period in history. So pretty much I'd use a hand-drawn map when the streets were slightly structured differently, and then I literally had to do the best I could to look at where they were and mark on the map where they were at. I'm saying that for all you other would-be amateur historians who are going to come on here, and when I say, oh, such and such a building was right here, you're going to be like, you idiot, such and such a building was right here. If I'm off by 50 feet, I'm sorry. I made a hand-done map based on pretty much the only actual maps that really diagrammed where everything was, which were hand-drawn, and so I'm not exactly using the most scientific method in existence. So if I say something was here, and it was here, give me a break. That being said, pretty much just a little bit this way, kind of where this building is, and there's some railroad tracks going through here. That's about as far east as the complex went. Now, it's important to remember that it's pretty much the Slabtown area now. It's you know, obviously, as you've seen, mostly industrial stuff, warehouses, whatnot. And that's why there's so many remains. Like, you can't really see it that well, but like over here, old railroad lines kind of buried in the concrete. There's railroad lines going through there that probably aren't being used anymore. They're kind of scattered all through this area because so much manufacturing and warehouses were here, so you put stuff on trains and took them to Union Station or out of town, wherever you needed to go. But yeah, this was the Guild Lake area. So there was actually a big lake just a little bit that way, and it literally had kind of it was more of a peninsula than an island, because to the furthest east end, you could still access this land, and then that was surrounded by a lake. So it was pretty low elevation at the time. And then after, sometime after the exposition, the lake was essentially filled in. So that's why there's nothing resembling a lake here anymore. But yeah, heading over this direction is where the furthest east buildings were in this complex. So I'm walking towards generally where 25th and Wilson meet, which is pretty much right where I'm standing almost. I think it's just right up here. And so there's a big building. You can't really see it that well, but there's a big building here, and so you can't like access beyond this point. But in this general area, this may even be 24th. I think this is 25th. Yeah. So, yeah, 25th is right over here, and in this area behind me, there was an auditorium. Both of these were about a block north of here, so they would have been a little bit beyond this building. But kind of just this side of 25th, so like just beyond this area, there was an auditorium building there. Now again, I'm getting the names of the buildings based on these animated maps that I looked at that, marked each thing. So again, if those are slightly inaccurate, again, I used hand-drawn maps that were done specifically for the exposition, so doing the best I can. And then just a little bit past it, just the other side of 25th, again about a block north of Wilson, there was what the map notes as the electricity, the electricity, machinery and transportation building. So they were located over here, and they were kind of off a little bit by themselves. There was kind of a block separating them from the rest of the buildings, because again, right over here, as the buildings kind of start lining this way and heading towards the Montgomery Park building, they were a lot more closer together, and then there was the big garden that was in between them. Here's another view looking from the west, because again, this is that big building I was showing you. So kind of in this area, this fenced off area over here, you can see they got the prison wire up. This general area is probably where the auditorium would have literally been, just the other side of this fence. And then the other building I mentioned that I can't remember the name of already would have been just beyond that. And then if you turn and look this way, again, 26th and Wilson's right there, so we're about a block further down. And there's a fairly good sized building here, and there's an old building here that clearly was gutted out and turned into a I'm assuming parking garage. But this is where two more buildings would have been, and again, one would have been kind of just slightly this side of 26th, one would have been just kind of slightly this side. Actually, roughly where this building is, and this building looks fairly old, but it couldn't be that old, and I haven't seen any references that this building still exists. And this building actually looks bigger than the building that was here, but there actually used to be approximately right here, where this building is now. This is where the agriculture and horticulture, I almost said horticulture. The agriculture and horticulture, I can't say it. Horticulture, Jesus. Agriculture and horticulture building would have been right here. And then you turn and literally just look, probably like right along where this fence line is, right across the street. And that would have been, I had to pull my notes out for this one. But again, pretty much right across the street from the agriculture and horticulture building, I still can't say it, right about here, would have been the manufacturing, liberal arts, and varied industries building. which based on the drawing was probably roughly about the same size as this building. But one of the most dynamic and at least photogenic aspects of the setup of the Lewis and Clark Exposition, and of course it existed almost straight, diagonal beeline back from the main entrance. Again, if the agriculture and horticulture, I don't even remember what it is now because I've messed it up so many times, horticulture building, which would have been, again, roughly where this building is. But again, I don't think it's the building. Well, I mean, obvious, it's not decked out enough. But yeah, if I look at my hopefully trusty map here, just the other side of this building would have been where the massive gardens were, which consisted essentially, there was a big statue and there was fountains and there was like the sunken gardens there. And that was located pretty much, 27th is right up here. So essentially it would have been this half of the block between, the west half of the block between 27th and 26th, as I see it. And it would have been roughly at Wilson and 27th and taking up space just essentially northeast of there. So really this, I think this is still just, this building that's been gutted out and turned into parking. But yeah, kind of starting, I mean, pretty much this structure is where the gardens were, because it starts a little this side of 26th and goes down to 27th and Wilson right down here. So really where this structure stands today, if you look beyond it and kind of imagine this, you'd be looking, I'm even holding it kind of diagonally, but this would be the gardens, the sunken gardens in the middle. If you were looking north, just past the entrance, which the entrance would be just the opposite direction, this is where you'd be looking to see the gardens there. And then beyond that, you start getting into the area 27th and Wilson, and you start getting into the area where the Montgomery Park building is. And buildings stood here where Montgomery Park is, and then stood even beyond it to the other side of the building. And here is the well-known, it stands out very much in this area because most buildings around here aren't that tall. This is big old Montgomery Park building. This is where I had my prom, one of the worst nights of my life. But I've already done a video about that. And anyway, it's described as the foreign palace stood primarily where the Montgomery Park building stands today. It stood more towards this side of it because it was just this side of 27th and Wilson, which that's this intersection right here. So the foreign palace would have been located right here, probably because I'm on the east side of the building. The eastern half of this building is where that would have been. And based again on the hand-drawn map, it shows that the foreign palace was a pretty good sized building, at least as big or larger than anything that I've already shown you from more the east side of the complex. So yeah, it probably would have taken up, you just barely see the Montgomery Park building through the foliage, but you can see how the building goes on. So probably about, again, almost the eastern half of this building towards this side would have been where that palace would have been located. And then right beyond it, probably towards the opposite end of the building going into the parking lot, because there's a big parking lot just past the building up here, that would have been where the Oriental Palace was located. Sorry, I'm coming to you so dark, I'm trying to keep the building in focus, but so I'm walking to the west end of the building. West end of the building is right here. So again, kind of the eastern half, like from here to the end. This is where the foreign palace would have been located. And if I turn the Oriental Palace would have been located probably just the front, or I guess the back edge of the building here, and kind of out into the parking lot a little bit. That is where the Oriental Palace would have been located. So literally right here behind me. And I did a video because it's one of the most iconic places that was here, which was the Forestry Building. Now everybody knows the Forestry Building. The Forestry Building was one of few things that was also left standing. Likely would still be here today if there wasn't an unfortunate intervention in 1964. And I actually think, again, based on the hand-drawn map. Now I did a video here where I more put the Forestry Building where this building is, which I guess it looks like it's like a maybe a school. There's a bunch of kids there, so I don't know if it's like a school, childcare type thing or what. But actually, based on the map, it showed that it was the Forestry Center was more like across the street from the Oriental Palace, and also the California Building, which was a little bit past it into the parking lot. Which works well for me, because if the Forestry Center was where that place is, I wouldn't be able to film there because there's kids outside on recess, and I'm not going to film that. So it's likely the Forestry Center was probably more right here as opposed to right there, because again, if the California building was over here, then the Forestry Center would have to be a little bit further this way and a little bit closer, because actually, as I found out, a few years, almost a decade after the, I believe it was 1914, the California building actually caught fire. And it was a bad enough fire that embers from it sparked a fire on the rooftop of the Forestry Center over here. Now the Forestry Center, when it was constructed, and I think probably even still when it let's just say disappeared, it was the largest technically it wasn't a log cabin, it was the largest log-built structure in the world. It was built almost entirely of logs, predominantly that I think were cut in Oregon and brought down here. So it was massive. It was super impressive. It was a forestry center, and it was kept around long after the exposition ended. And it actually, the roof of it caught fire after the California building, which was again roughly over this way, just the other side of the Oriental Palace. It actually, the roof caught fire, and they were actually able to stop the fire, and they were able to, you know, keep the building from being thoroughly damaged. And they thought the fire was so big that it could have. This is essentially the Portland Heights neighborhood is kind of around here, and they said at the time that the fire could have destroyed the whole entire Portland Heights neighborhood if it hadn't been contained as quickly as it had been. So in 1914, within a decade of its construction, the Forestry Center was saved from being burnt down, which is impressive because, you know, firefighting tactics and capabilities back then were much less than they are now. We're talking about a building that was exclusively made out of wood that they were able to keep from being burned down. Now, unfortunately, decades down the road, 1960s come about. It's believed that there was kind of faulty electricity, probably a wire. That's kind of the general storyline, but it set off a fire in the Forestry Center that was so just explosive. It completely destroyed the Forestry Center. The Forestry Center was rebuilt and now stands over by the Oregon Zoo and the Children's Museum up in the West Hills around Washington Park. But yeah, the fire that started in 1964 destroyed the Forestry Center was so just huge and bombastic and just flaming hot. It actually caused a lot of damage to the Montgomery Park building, which, I mean, you think about the building was probably over here, like that's right across the street and pretty close, but we're still talking, I mean, dozens of feet, and it actually caused a considerable amount of damage to this building when it finally was burned down. So had it not been for that tragic event, in addition to the Fairmount Hotel, the Forestry Center might still be standing here today. I don't see why they'd get rid of it. It was such a popular landmark. And so from the Montgomery Park building, which again, the Forestry Center would have been just a little bit this way, past this and like the next building, it's not here on the main drag, which I feel people would see it more often. But if you go up to the next block here and hook a right and go west, there actually is a little plaque. It probably stands where where like the opposite side of the forestry center was located, which might explain why it's located here. Yeah, by that name, these apartments here, they probably stand generally where the forestry center was. This would just be the opposite side of it from where I was at earlier. And yeah, so here we are. This is 28th and I don't know if this is Upshur. No. Am I right? Yeah, 28th and Upshur. You can't read it, but you can trust that I'm right. And right in front of these apartments, there's this little plaque. And this delves in more into the history of the forestry center. So yeah, built in 1904, leading into the proceedings itself, and you get some imagery of here. See how huge it was. This is the inside of it, and here it is being torched, unfortunately. Yeah. So night of August 17th, 1964, world's largest log cabin burned to the ground. So yeah, it was August 17th, 1964. And so yeah, there's this little plaque here commemorating it, as this was probably the backside of the center. And again, you know, because as I said, these buildings were kind of going diagonally this way. The Foreign Palace would have been, again, roughly where this building is. But, you know, again, everything kind of coming this way. The Oriental Palace, just our side of where the Foreign Palace was, actually would have been partially in the street here. So it would have been more kind of, you know, through here. And then it kind of kept going this way, so that kind of puts, again, the forestry center kind of right here, just right across the street from here. So yeah, probably still would have put it in this area, kind of up this little incline here. But still, I mean, you see the Montgomery Park building still a pretty good distance away and considerably bigger than the forestry center. It's amazing how much damage was done to this building by that fire. Now I'm to the again, now I'm on the west side of the Montgomery Park building. Before I was on the east side of it. So all those locations, buildings I showed you, all lined up kind of here through there, going back that way. And we're kind of getting closer to now the western end of where the complex was. And this is the big parking lot behind the big Montgomery Park building. And there was a string of buildings here. Again, the California building was located here. There was a lot of little buildings here named after states in the vicinity. There was a California building, there was a Washington building that was also in this parking lot area. There was an Idaho building. But as I get to, this is the back end of the parking lot, and this road wraps around to Nikolai down here, which again, these streets existed, but they had different names. I know one of them was named Astor, after John Jacob Astor. But this general area through here, at the back end of the parking lot, you know, further away from the building over here, and kind of dipping down, would have been where, this is where Centennial Park was located. Here, all through this back end, kind of going up to where these two roads meet, was called Centennial Park, which makes total sense. The whole purpose of the thing was we were celebrating the centennial of when Lewis and Clark hoofed their way across the country and found themselves, you know, passing through Oregon on their way to the west end of America. So it made all the sense in the world to have a park, Centennial Park, named after the event like that in the area where this was occurring. And I mean, it's not really a park here anymore, but to this day, there's, you know, there's a little bit of grass here, and then a building back there. There's a little something here for your enjoyment. And this brings us back to, this is Nikolai and 29th. This is back where I started. I literally started right over there for this video because after passing these buildings and these parks, this is Guild's Lake essentially started just the other side of Nikolai here. So a lot of what existed beyond here was the lake, and then there was the little arm, the little peninsula that branched out, and there was the long bridge that crossed, you know, cut right through the lake and took you to the island for, you know, the rest of what there was to be seen of the Lewis and Clark Exposition. And now, as the adventure continues, again, the bridge that bridged the lake was essentially lined up with 29th Avenue here, as I said. So again, you know, as I walk this way, you would essentially be walking, approaching and stepping onto the bridge that crossed the lake that was here. Again, believe it or not, there used to be a lake pretty much right here. And you would just be going until you'd reach that peninsula. And then there was so much more to see right there. Literally, 1905, you would be walking on the bridge right now, going out to the island, which is still probably almost a couple hundred feet ahead. And you'd see the massive U.S. government building right up over here. And it's crazy to think that you'd be on a bridge looking over a lake, you'd look this way, this would just all be water. Over here, this would just all be water. And then you're just on a bridge in the middle of it, just enjoying essentially what was practically a World's Fair level event here. And yeah, it's astonishing how far you'd have to walk, because there's supposed to come to Industrial Street. And the intersection of 29th here and Industrial Street would have been completely underwater in 1905. This is interesting. This thing says a view from the bridge. And 114 years ago, we would have been on a bridge right now. Yeah, here we go. We're coming up to the intersection, finally, of Industrial, which is the crossing street. And again, we would still be on the bridge as we walk along. And again, you know, it's so amazing. You look at these images of what it looked like here for the exposition, just insanely beautiful. And now you come through here and it's just all industrial. I mean, literally, they have all the buildings numbered because there's so many industrial buildings out here. Hello. What's a bus like you doing in a lot like this? Is this like a big old spool? There's a lot of interesting things out here. Or is this supposed to be like a big old wheel, like a wagon wheel? I don't know. But yeah, we'd still be standing over the lake right now. This building looks practically vacant. And yeah, you've got a lot of old train lines that serve or train tracks that don't really serve a purpose today. Now, the island, I mean, they called it an island for the lake. It worked its way from up here and it kind of diagonaled its way this way. So here where the bridge was, you'd still be on the bridge, you'd still be over the lake. But if you go like just a block down here, this is, you see the railroad lines crossing about where that van is. That's 30th and Industrial. We'd essentially be walking onto land now. So this would all be land here. And then the lake would be pretty much right across the street here. And the island ended just a little ways up here and kind of wrapped around, went north and went back that way. But yeah, actually right in this vicinity of 30th and Industrial is probably overlooking the lake. Is probably a very pretty view. There was a restaurant here. Again, according to the map, it looks like it was called Peel's Restaurant or PL. It was like P-I-E-H-L. Peel's restaurant, I'm not sure. And they said it would have been located, again, you know, I'm doing this based on a drawn map that the hardest was to figure out exact locations that were on the island here, because the drawn map, you could see, like, on the other end of the shore, you could see where the streets were crossing, so you could line them up pretty well. But once you got up here, you didn't have the streets, you couldn't see the markers for the streets running east and west or north and south anymore, so I really had to try to narrow it down. But roughly, it would have been just north of the intersection here at 30th and Industrial, so pretty much right here. This area behind me that's fenced off, kind of between this brewery here and whatever the hell this building is used for. Right here would have been pretty much where, again, Peel's restaurant would have been roughly located right here. And the island, again, would have only gone a little bit further this way and then kind of started wrapping north and going up and around. And I apologize for having to yell loud. I am in an industrial area, and it ain't 1905 anymore, so they're not transporting stuff on trains through this area anymore. Just big, loud, freaking trucks. I mean, honestly, do these tracks look like they've been used recently? But from here, I'm going to venture on to another location. This looks like this was probably, as far as being on the island, this was the furthest west building there was. It was kind of off to like the very far west edge of the island in the Gills Lake area here. And I want to take you there not just because it was kind of the furthest west standing building on the island, but also because there's another little interesting piece of Portland history to this that harkens into the history of this area immediately after the Lewis and Clark Exposition wrapped, and suddenly there wasn't really much of a need for anything that had been built in this area anymore, tragically. Now, continuing to travel west, again, this general area right here behind me, this gravelly area, is where the Peel's restaurant would have been. It would have been a little bit further down, roughly at where Industrial and maybe like 32nd would be, because there isn't an Industrial in 32nd. So just a little ways down here would have been, I think it was called the Life-Saving Building. So I don't know if it was like a hospital on site. I'm guessing that's what it was, or some kind of first aid location. And it was a building that was on kind of the west edge, again, of the island that was once here. I'd be swimming right now if the lake was still the way it was back then. And as I continue to walk, I remember seeing this when I was kind of looking through the area on Google Maps and trying to find a representation of where this building roughly would have been within close proximity. And I remember there was railroad tracks here, which I don't even know if they're still being used, but yeah, there's tracks crossing literally right up here. And I figured this would have been, where these tracks are is roughly where this life-saving building would have been. So again, along the edge of the lake would have been existing over here and wrapping around this way. And then you've got the West Hills, and this is mostly Forest Park up here, that would have loomed above the lake. So yeah, you see there's railroad lines that maybe they're still being used. They don't look like they're being used. And you see that you've got lines coming through here, wrapping through, and then they kind of go over here. And yeah, it doesn't really look like any of them have been used recently. Either that or these are some very resilient weeds. But yes, again, you know, maybe just this side of the street, or just this side, but pretty much within at least probably 20 feet of where I'm standing is where the life-saving building would have been. So we would have been on like a cliff's edge looking down at the lake here. And that brings us to another interesting dynamic, which is the history of the area after the exposition, which ties into this specific area, generally where this life-saving station building, whatever it was located, at a place that's would roughly be industrial and maybe a little bit past 32nd and between 32nd and 33rd if they did pass through here, but they don't. Now, it's important to realize that this was essentially kind of a knockoff World's Fair, and it was much like when we think of like the Olympics nowadays. You know, as cities vie, they invest so much into trying to get the the Summer Olympics in their town, you know, when it happens every 4 years. And you know, they invest all this money and they build a state-of-the-art stadium, a swimming facility, and these beautiful hotels for the the athletes to stay in. They invest all this money, and then the Olympics come, the Olympics go, and the massive complex is essentially just abandoned, and most of them are left to ruin. Like, I've seen people do urban exploration videos at locations where Olympics were once held. You know, it was 2000, 2004, 2008, you know, not too far back. I think somebody explored the areas around when they had the Olympics in Rio. And it wasn't too long after, only a couple years after the Olympics had ended. And just everything was just completely forgotten and abandoned there. And that was kind of what happened here. Like, this was all this insanity was constructed with the objective of having this one event, and then afterwards there wasn't any plan for what to do with this stuff. As the years passed, you know, some buildings kind of just fell apart, but you know, it's insane that the lake was still here. All the stuff, for the most part, was just left here to rot and to go to waste. And, you know, much like an Olympic Village back in the day. This truck's about to make a lot of noise on these train tracks. Could have been worse. But what really interested me was the fact that beyond how everything in this area was just kind of left to go to waste, it was, you know, there was just a lot of nothing left out here. And so it kind of became not a shanty town, but it kind of became just kind of a rundown area for really poor people to live. So you had these people living in these kind of, you know, small rundown dwellings, just a lot of poor people, and they were just living in these dwellings that were surrounded by these collapsing structures. And that gets at the heart of it seems like a forgotten Portland case, because this was a very big deal, and this happened in 1908, so it's only 3 years after the exposition ends. And it was, as far as I can see, it was one of the first, if not the first, cases in Portland history where the question was genuinely addressed. Should you be allowed to charge a child for murder? And what happened was, it was 1908, I believe, and again, people have started inhabiting this area. And there was an 11-year-old kid named Jackson Reed who lived in a house that newspapers say was right next to the life-saving building. That building was presumably still standing. So Jackson Reed lived in a dwelling that was probably right in this general area, because again, the lake would have been right over here. So Jackson Reed probably lived somewhere in this area. And in 1908, there was a family out fishing in the lake that was here. And it was like a father and son, but it was like an older father and then a son who was like an adult age. So the father, who was an older gentleman, I think one of his hooks broke, and he had to bring his boat to the shore to address that issue. And one of the big things about this area was you had a lot of poor, struggling people, but because it was such a rundown area in the years following the exposition, there was a lot of transients and a lot of bums. They never called them homeless. They were always transients and bums and fiends and, you know, things like big dramatic words like that. And they would constantly infiltrate this area, and the people that lived here hated them. They were sick of it, so they became very defensive about who could come into this area, particularly, you know, the island, because so many of them were these sketchy homeless people that would, you know, sleep in your front yard and steal your stuff and try to incite violence to some degree. So Jackson Reed, you know, it's like an 11-year-old kid. He's out here playing with some of the other kids in this area, and they're kind of down by the shoreline. And they see this guy who's just coming ashore, apparently to fix his hook or whatever. They see him come to the shore, and according to the initial story that comes out, they start accosting him. They're like, "You're trespassing. You can't be on this island," because they've been trained to be paranoid about any strangers showing up. And what happens is very hazy at this point. The initial story is that these kids accost this man, and eventually Jackson Reed tells his sister, go get me, go get me my dad's gun or the family gun, get me a gun. And apparently his sister, who I think was younger than him, ran to the house and brought him a gun. And he pointed it at the man and was just like, don't move. And again, the initial story seems to imply that Jackson Reed was a little kid and he didn't really know what he was doing, and he just kind of either panicked or didn't realize the implications of what he was doing, and he just shot the guy dead in cold blood. Now that was the initial story. Now the story that kind of followed after, now again, a lot of these were witness accounts of the other kids, people who lived on the island, people that had a reason to defend this kid over this random stranger that had come ashore. They claimed that he had come ashore and he immediately started accosting these kids and yelling at them and threatening them. It seems like maybe the kid said, hey, you're not supposed to be here, and this guy was like, I'm an adult, I don't have to listen to you kids. And apparently he was being very menacing and very threatening towards these kids, and it was that behavior that incited Jackson Reed to shoot him. But whatever the case, it was very unnerving to local authorities in this area. And again, this would have happened like right here. The railroad tracks are right there, the lake would have been here, the life-saving building would have been right here, Jackson Reed probably lived somewhere around here. This all would have been happening right in this area, kind of behind me. Now, Jackson Reed didn't really do himself any favors, because when authorities showed up and asked what happened, he very matter-of-factly, almost probably chillingly, was just like, I shot him. And he didn't seem to really care, he didn't seem to have any remorse, so there was a lot of like, this kid's just messed up. And he probably just shot him because he's a lunatic. And so it brought about questions of whether this 11-year-old kid should be indicted for murder. And so, it was a chaotic situation. It was a trial proceeding that was never going to be easy. Sorry again for another loud truck. But a trial of sorts did happen in regards to what happened in this area. And it came out ultimately that Jackson Reed had been heavily influenced by, I can't remember if it was his biological father or his stepfather, but the father figure in his life. He said, well, my dad taught me, because all these homeless people and stuff are coming into this area, and, they're a danger to us, and they bother us, and they steal stuff, and, my dad told me, don't be afraid, pick up a gun and defend yourself, defend your home. And then when they got his father, again, I think it was his father, up to testify, he didn't help himself, because he pretty much made it like whoa, bug on me, get off me, bug. He pretty much implied that he pretty much taught his kid, even at an early age, anybody bothers you, anybody messes, you pick up a gun and you shoot them. Like, he was so vigilant, and he was so filled with visceral hatred of the fact that it was all these homeless people loitering, in his area, where my home is. You're strangers, you're not allowed out here. And yeah, it came out that he had pretty much taught this very impressionable young child, strangers come to this island, bums come to this island, you just pick up a gun and shoot them. So he'd really kind of poisoned this boy's mind, and so he was let off for that. But a lot of people, because essentially nobody was really ever charged for the case, but a lot of people wanted his father charged. They were like, this guy completely contaminated this boy's mind to the point that he, the moment a stranger came onto the island, whether this man who was out fishing had threatened him or not, he pretty much, the fact that he told his younger sister, go get me a gun right now, get the gun. And then she brought him the gun, and he just coolly held it, tried to control the situation, and then just gunned the guy down. People were kind of pissed that his watchful protector guardian wasn't actually charged in relation to this, because it was really his teaching and his tutelage that brought about this case that happened here. About 3 years after the exposition happened. But it's just reading about how, all the buildings were a lot of the buildings were still here, and a lot of them were abandoned or gutted out. That's kind of how the California building which I think was gutted out, and somehow a fire started there that almost, you know, ruined the Portland Heights neighborhood up in the hills here, or at least they argued it could have. And that's the part, again, the part of history that I really wish we had more visual evidence of, or a little bit more knowledge about, is when this area, you know, this area post Exposition, when it was just, everything was just left to just completely fall apart, and there was just kind of, the only people that lived out here were these kind of just poor people who were constantly fending off homeless people left and right. And I know ultimately as time went on, the decision was made to kind of get rid of these buildings that have been left out here. Most of them had been, you know, neglected and severely damaged. It wasn't really worth it to restore any of them, so they were finished off essentially. And ultimately, you know, they wanted more land, and they wanted to develop this as a more industrial area, you know, because we're kind of close to the river, we're kind of close to the train station. They were able to run, you know, a lot of these railroad tracks through here, and so they filled in the lake, which gave them more land, and they started, you know, redeveloping this area as, you know, a more industrial area. And that's why to this day, look at all them kegs in there. I mean, there's a brewery right across the street, so it makes sense that these are all here. But yeah, that's how you got kind of the onset of this area. You know, no more lake, no more, you know, structural remains of the Exposition, and they started, you know, making it more industrial, and hence, you know, the whole area is to this day very industrial. That's why essentially it looks the way that it does today, and nothing like it did in 1905. Alright, so now we've backtracked, we're back to industrial and 29th. We are currently swimming in Guild Lake and getting up to 29th and climbing out of the water and getting onto the bridge and resuming travels north. Because we still, again, you know, the island kind of made its way this way, so down there would be land, but it also had to make its way kind of in this direction. And essentially the bridge ended, or it came to landfall halfway between that street and then industrial, which crosses over here. So we'd be right about where these trees start here. You start seeing it shadowed. That's about where landfall would be on the island from the passenger bridge. And you look back and you think the bridge pretty much started way back there at 29th and Nikolai, where that street light is. And look at how far down we are. I mean, there's the intersection way down there, and we're still just about to make landfall. And this whole area over here was just another massive like garden park walking through area that stood directly in front of the U.S. government building, which as far as I can tell was probably the largest building on site here. And yeah, right about now we'd be making landfall on the island peninsula in Guild, you know, between the Guilds Lake. So as we've just made landfall from the lake that ends right over here, again, this would have been this big open, like, walking area. Images you see of the big U.S. government building, which is probably one of the most beautiful buildings put here, and you'll see there's like a big space in front of it, kind of in line with, again, you know, the walking bridge would be 29th here. So yeah, this would have all been that big space before you get to the U.S. government building. And I think I'm coming, yeah, I think Luzon, if I'm saying that street name right, is right up here. So yeah, again, you know, theoretically I may be off by 20, 30, 40 feet, but right about where the shadows start and the brightness dies would have been roughly where the bridge would have hit land, and you'd now be walking kind of through this open area, presumably towards the government building, because it was the most impressive building there. And just a little further up, we've come to Nella Street. This is where Nella crosses 29th. And the U.S. government building would have been literally right in front of us. Pretty much, see these railroad tracks? It probably would have, this would have been like the front of the building, would have been where those railroad tracks are, and it just would have stood here. Like, you'd literally just be standing here staring up at the massive US government building. Again, by the animated map I looked at, matching that with actual Google Maps, it implied that it was located almost right at the intersection of, again, what's called Nella Street and then 29th crossing, and it would have been just kind of, it would have started right here. So the big US government building was located right here. And all these years later, you'd never know. You'd never know such a massive, magnanimous structure stood here. Absolutely crazy. So I'm literally walking on the ground. I would literally be walking inside into the building and walking inside of it right now. And it was huge, so probably where this building is, it probably would have dwarfed this building. It just would have filled this whole freaking area. And as I continued north, it looks like it says Guam is the next street, and that essentially would have been where that was how thin the island was. You think just, you know, like 2 blocks back that way is where the bridge would have hit land, and now we'd be on land, and then right up here, the next street would be pretty much the northern edge of the island, and you'd be going back into the lake. So the lake was like a horseshoe that wrapped around the island. But again, if you went east, you could get to land again. But I don't really know if there was any roads really developed there yet or anything. You might have not really been able to get anywhere if you went to that end, so it was a lot easier to just cross the bridge located along 29th. So maybe it isn't called Guam. This is very, look it out for my life, this is very New York of us right here. I thought this would be called Guam, but actually looks like, so yeah, it says this is where 31st Avenue and 29th meet. That's why I say it's very New York of us. It's very rare that numbered streets meet. But they did it, so I think my presumption is this is essentially pretty much right in line with these railroad tracks right here. It's probably the northern edge of the island would have been, so this, beyond it would have all just been the lake again. So we are at the furthest north point, essentially, of where the exposition took place, because north of that it was just lake, and then probably a lot of rural lands and farmlands and things like that. But yeah, so if you came to this island, there was a few things to see, but really it was predominantly, again, it would have been located just like this whole area right here behind this massive building. That would have been where the US government building was. And I should point out, there was another building. I want to say it was called, looking out for my life, I want to say it was called the Massachusetts building. Don't hold me to that, but I believe that's what it was called. And it actually was taken apart in pieces and was relocated. It doesn't stand anymore, so I'm not going to the site because there's nothing to see. There's, you know, homes there now, but it was actually taken from here and relocated to the general area of 66th and Belmont, which is like, geez, 100 blocks from here. Now, the Massachusetts building was probably located south of the island, because again, there was buildings all around that were named after various states. But it was a pretty impressive building unto itself, but it actually was relocated, and it was used as a sanatorium. And the only reason I really know that is it was from research I was doing for my video about the history of the Mall 205 site, and I was studying about the Morningside Sanatorium that stood there, and I think there was a correlation between the two, the one that ended up where Mall 205 is now, and the one that was in the Massachusetts building, again, like 100 blocks from here. But as I start meandering back south, about ready to get back on the bridge to get off this island, one last thing I want to show you is there was one hotel, and it helps me transition as well. So there was only one actual hotel that was on the grounds, and that was the American Inn. It was a massive hotel, and it was located, I think, just south of the lake, so it was more kind of, it was essentially a little bit west of where the like California Washington Building, Centennial Park, essentially directly this way, you know, heading back down 29th. It was a little bit this way. And the reason I'm saving this hotel, which is called the American Inn, for the end here, as far as locations where buildings were and whatnot, is because I do want to show you some of the structures that do still actually exist in relation to the exposition grounds that were here. And they've pretty much, most of them have been moved, which probably saved them from being demolished. So the site I'm taking you to, the American Inn isn't there anymore, it's just more industrial stuff, but it helps us transition into taking a look at some of the things that do still exist from this area in other areas. Alright, we're back at, God, you can't see it. There it is, 29th and Nikolai behind me. 29th is a crossing, so you'd be going way off that way to get to the island. But just a little ways over here is where the American Inn was actually located. So kind of towards, another place that was towards the far west end of the overall complex. And from the intersection down here, if you just kind of slowly pan, kind of just past this building, where it kind of opens up a little bit over here, and you'll notice this street, which today is it's Nikolai. It becomes St. Helens Road up here though, like right at the turn, and it starts to turn and wrap along the hills up here. So this big area here, kind of where the road turns, this is where the American Inn would have been located. Now, it was a big hotel, so it probably ran from way over where these buildings are to roughly, you know, where these buildings are, and it would have been just south of the big lake that would have been overlooking the island over there. And then, you know, again, most of the buildings that I showed you earlier would be kind of up the hill over in this direction. So yeah, the American Hotel would have just been right over here behind me. And the American Inn does not exist in its fullness. It's not all still around, but there is still some of it around, just obviously not right here. And with that said, I'm gonna head out to these couple of spots. Holy hell! Anyway, I'm gonna head out and show you some spots where there are still remains of this once beautiful, bustling area that was bustling in its exposition type way for actually a very short period of time. Now, because the general location where the exposition was held was, again, never really intended to have a purpose beyond the exposition itself, very little of what was constructed there still stands today. One example, in terms of something in a completely different area, is there was a building that was on site at the exposition that is now the pub over in St. John's. So they literally took this whole building, moved it across the Willamette River to its new site. Not only moved it across, but moved it pretty far north. St. John's is about as far north as you can get in this city, still be civilized. But as far as things in the area, specifically, things that didn't get moved that far but still were moved, because I think on site there's only one building that still remains as far as being where it was originally built. But I'm about to pass the intersection of 21st, Northwest 21st and Northrop, and the American Inn, which is a massive hotel complex on the grounds. It was the only hotel there, so of course it was huge because they either were expecting massive numbers, they didn't know how many to expect, so might as well be prepared. So the American Inn was a massive hotel, and we're actually several blocks southeast of where the exposition site was. So they moved this building a pretty good way. They didn't move the whole hotel, but there's parts of the hotel that exist right up here as condominiums, so you can compare imagery from back then to what still remains. You can see like, oh yeah, that is part of this big hotel that stood there. Yeah, here it is. It goes back a ways, and it's part of the original building. Yeah, it's even still got a sign on it that says America. You can't really see it that well from here, but this sign does say American Inn on it. You can see that rooftop up there. That's very, let's get some work done on it, but that's very particular to the American Inn. So this is like one end of the building. I don't know if this is exactly what end, because I know it was like this on, you know, both ends. So I don't know if this was the west end or the east end of the building, but this is remains of the structure. So, looking at this side, this wall looks like it's been like redone. Like, you know, concrete wall was put in and windows were put over it, so I'm guessing this is the end, which would mean it was probably, that's the furthest east end of the building. That's my prediction. Then again, the other side may look exactly the same, so it may be indistinguishable, but that suggests to me that that is eastern portion of the building. And then, technically, while it was actually built outside of the general complex, because it was built pretty much diagonal from the main entrance, this last place, which is, again, the only piece to the exposition that's still in its original site, was built in relation to the exposition. It was built because that was happening. And, again, it still remains in its original spot, approximately at 26th and Vaughn, which I'm heading over to right now. So the intersection here is actually 26th and Upshur, I think is what it's called. But yeah, this structure right here over my shoulder, that's the Fairmount Hotel, built in 1905 in relation to, again, the Lewis and Clark Exposition, and it still stands here today between Upshur here and then Vaughn is the next street down. Literally, the Fairmount apartments here were located right across the street from the main entrance. The main entrance was literally right here behind me. And so the northwest corner, which would have been right here, this was wide open. And this was the big, grand main entrance to the complex, if you can call it that. This was where you entered, and then just all the buildings and everything just existed beyond this gate. So we're kind of at the southernmost point of where things began. And of course the Fairmount Hotel, which is now the Fairmount Apartments, it was right across the street from the main entrance, so still conveniently placed. Alright gang, well that's it. One more time with the old Fairmount Hotel. Again, the only structure still standing in its original area in relation to the exposition. I am gonna wrap it on that. Hope you guys enjoyed my my little weaving through, running through, showing you all the sites in relation to the Lewis and Clark Exposition of 1905. And as always, remember to like, share, subscribe, talk to your friends, family, complete strangers on the street. And hit up my Patreon if you so choose, want to help me out in that way. I may be coming to a point where I'm actually going to have to kind of start utilizing Patreon more. Stuff's happening in my future, so I don't really know exactly, but hit me up if you want to help me out in that way. And other than that, till next time, this has been Steve the Amateur Historian.